It seems like I'm meeting more and more Afrikaner Catholics, which is interesting because Afrikaans culture is sort of anti-Catholic, and it's very Dutch Calvinist. It's very NG, Dutch Reformed. Specifically in my ancestry, which is French Huguenot, it is the king has revoked the Edict of Nantes, and we need to get out of France because if we don't, we could die. So let's escape. And wouldn't you know, some of us are going east, some of us are going west, but some of us are going south. We're going to South Africa, where we're going to start a new life. And that culture and the kind of people that very at the very genesis of the culture's history, you have a resentment for the Catholic faith. So it's strange that I continue to meet Protestants, Afrikaner Protestants, who have a growing fascination with the Catholic faith and they want to convert. Now, I'm also a convert to Catholicism, and I happen to be an RCIA teacher at my parish, and I frequently get emails from Afrikaners who say, hey, I am looking to join a church. When are your mass times? What is the RCIA program? How can I join? How can I get started? And as I get to know these people, it's interesting how much what's happening here in my very limited experience, how much of that is reflected in what seems to be happening in the world today, at least in many parts of Europe and in America, where people have the sort of evangelical circles around them, they have the more traditional Protestant churches around them, and then they have the more ancient churches, and people seem to be leaning more towards something that is old and ancient. I won't repeat all the points that you already have probably heard, but it's fascinating that that's happening even here in South Africa with what to me seems to be a culture that is very much opposed to Catholicism. But something interesting has happened, and I'd like to talk to that a little bit, or I can sort of see a pattern here that you might find helpful. So I should first sort of address maybe a question that you might be wondering is, does it not seem to be breaking with tradition for me to not be a Protestant, right? Is it not wrong ethically or morally or in some way? Am I not turning my back on all my ancestors by becoming a Catholic, right? Is that not against this idea that we should return to tradition? Would returning to tradition not mean that I should return to the tradition of sort of classical Protestantism? And I would just sort of, I've thought about this question a lot because it's a good question. The question just becomes, where do you want to draw the line? Because I could also just look at the French Huguenots and say, well, they broke with tradition by protesting the Catholic faith of their ancestors. You could just as well say that it's a return to the tradition that the Protestants broke away from. In many ways, if you meet an Afrikaner Catholic, they are basically just protesting Protestantism. They're protesting a culture which they see as something that is broken away or fallen away from the core root of the tree. But this video is not trying to be apologetic. It's not trying to make a case for Catholicism. I just thought I should mention that. What's interesting is, in some sense, the fact that Christians and Christianity and the practice of Christianity has become more and more nominal through this sort of process of postmodernity, as the death of God is proclaimed and people begin to loosen themselves from their moral shackles, and those people then have children, and those children then grow up in a post-truth world. What I'm trying to say here is that when I interact with Afrikaners today, the millennial Afrikaners and the Gen Z Afrikaners don't really understand the reasons, or aren't even aware of the reasons why Afrikaans culture sort of has an anti-Catholic sentiment. They're not aware of any of the history. So it's as the generations have gone by And as the intensity of Protestant faith has sort of loosened, it's almost as if people have they have this rebellion that they're a part of, but they don't understand the cause of that rebellion anymore. They don't see in their interactions with Catholics all of the historical injustices that might have been far more vehemently communicated to them, to their parents, by their parents and their great-great-parents and their great-great-parents. This laxity of the faith has left people sort of ignorant to why are we even Protestant anymore? What are we protesting? Even the very term Protestant doesn't really bear much weight. People don't identify with it in the way that I think people did in the past. And what I'm saying now, applying it to a very specific cultural group, you might be able to apply to a specific cultural group in your environment, or you might see what I'm saying in a slightly different way, but you might resonate with what I mean. Now, if I think about the millennials and the Gen Zs that I've interacted with, specifically now talking about sort of Protestant, Afrikaner, Gen Z millennials, I can sort of group them into 4 general categories. So by far the most common group, like I'll just call them Group 1. Group 1 are they grew up in a nominally religious home. They're Christian, but they went to church. Sometimes they didn't always go to church. I kind of grew up like this myself as well. And they don't really know enough about Christianity to really even be upset at the different groups or the different denominations, or to understand why there's these severances in the body, right? They encounter a Catholic and their initial response is not sort of anti-Catholic. It's curiosity. It's sort of, oh, this is interesting, this is different, this is perhaps strange. They don't really understand their own position, so they're not even really, couldn't even really call them Protestant in the sort of historical sense of the term. And so because they're not fully Protestant, they're not really protesting the Catholic faith. And when they encounter a Catholic, they're sort of curious. They're interested. They want to know. They think it's interesting. They want to know how it's changed your life. This has been my encounter with, this has been my experience with, through many encounters with many different, I would say, sort of nominal Protestants. And they might also just not be religious at all, but they still have a love for Christ, even if they haven't fully fleshed out why that is or what that means for their life. Group number 2 are guys who are Protestant, who know it, but they are quite anti-Catholic. So I remember actually at a work event I was at, I met a guy who had a Cairo tattoo on his forearm, and we were just chatting, and I just sort of said, hey, that's a cool Cairo tattoo. And he said, oh, wow, you know the Cairo, and we started having this conversation. And I asked him, what other tattoos do you have? Do you have anything else sort of Christian? And he said, yes. And he pulled up his arm sleeve and he had a tattoo of the 5 solas, right? So he had all of the sola scriptura, sola fide, and so on and so on. So I sort of chuckled internally. I thought, okay, this is going to be a fun conversation, because he was also Afrikaans. And I started telling him about the fact that I'm Catholic. And his reaction was a mix of excitement and sort of, oh no, where's this gonna go? I thought me and this guy were kind of clicking, but now I don't know where this conversation's headed. And he started telling me, sort of very charitably, he would say things like, okay, I know there are Catholics who are saved, but we shouldn't. I don't personally believe we should be praying to the dead. And then he would say things like, there's, of course, there's only one mediator. My sense from talking to this guy and talking to guys like him is that he loves his beliefs and he loves Christ, but he doesn't really know that much about Catholicism. He hasn't really done the deep dive yet into understanding why Catholics pray to saints, in understanding what we mean when we invoke a saint to pray. He does, his point about Christ being the only mediator just kind of reveals to me that he's not necessarily a bad guy, but he's not acting in bad faith, I should say, but he just doesn't understand how we understand intercessory prayer. So his arguments are not listing what the Catholic believes and then listing his problems with it. Each of his problems are points that we don't believe. Each of his problems and issues with the faith are things that we don't affirm. And he's essentially creating I wouldn't even say a straw man. He's just creating a sort of phantasm of what he thinks Catholics believe based on what he's been perhaps taught or what he's heard, somebody say online. Maybe he's heard some Protestant guy on YouTube say this is what Catholics believe, and he's kind of like attacking those phantasms, and I'm standing there agreeing with him that would be silly. And I'm sure you can relate if you're Catholic. I'm sure in your own circumstances you've met this guy too. So as opposed to group one, this guy does know the inner mechanics of his faith perhaps a bit better, but he hasn't taken the time to really look into what it is he's protesting. Then we have group three, and this is, I would say, like many of my close friends. So they're Protestant, they're sincere, they love Christ, they understand the Catholic position, they like the Catholic position, they have a lot of respect for Catholics, but they cannot bring themselves to assent to some of the Marian dogmas and to the infallibility of the Pope, and probably a few other sticking points for them. They also are typically embedded in Protestant communities where for them to become Catholic would likely mean the loss of several communal aspects of their lives. It would affect their relationships with their parents, with many of their broader family, their extended family. But they don't see the Catholic Church as a force for evil. They consider Catholics as Christians. Even some of them that I know would love to be Catholic, but they can't wrap their heads around the Assumption of Mary, for example. And I must say, I'm good friends with many members of a university campus apologetics group here in South Africa called Ratio Christi. And all of them are Protestants, and some of them are ministers, some of them are pastors, and we're great friends. Our children play together. We have fellowship. We have brotherly love. We have disagreements, but they understand what it is the Catholic affirms, and for various reasons that feel for them a violation of their own conscience and their own goodwill, they can't bring themselves to become Catholic. And so I would say this group is definitely that sort of sincere Protestant that I have a lot of love for. So yeah, at the risk of repeating myself, it's interesting to see how what I'm experiencing in my own little microcosm is happening all over the world. And you have more and more Catholics emerging in anti-Catholic culture because the anti-Catholic culture has amnesia and it's sort of lost its identity. People are hungry for a larger narrative with which that they can embed themselves into. They're hungry for the kind of structure that the sacraments provide, the physicality they provide. And then you have this explosion of Catholic social media, Catholic apps, people like Bishop Barron who are doing, I think, really phenomenal work, to be honest with you. I know many people who, when they talk to me about RCIA, one of the first names that comes up is Bishop Barron. And I just think it's hard for us to see the shifting as it's happening. And in many ways, it's a very long and in many ways slow shift. But there's a lot of sincere people who are becoming Catholic, who are going to raise their kids in that tradition. And I don't know what, your culture is going to look like in 100 years. I don't know what my culture is going to look like in 100 years. Afrikaner culture could look very, very, very different in 100 years. And it seems like the sort of Dutch Calvinist identity, for good and for bad, is not something that many Afrikaners cling to in the same way that our forefathers did. Anyway, I just wanted to share those thoughts with you guys. If you enjoyed this video, please like it. Please let me know what you think in the comments. Of course, I'm obligated to say, at the behest of the algorithm, please subscribe so you get my videos in your notification feed. It helps the channel, and it's completely free to do it. And then if you feel so moved and you want to support the channel, you can buy me a coffee following the link in the description, or you can become a channel member and get access to member-only live streams. Those will begin once I actually have some members, because I just launched it. Thank you very much for being here. God bless you, and I wish you a lovely day. And if I said anything stupid or I said anything that was just false, I pray that you'll please have charity. Thank you so much. Goodbye.